Our first scriptures comes from Isaiah chapter 11, verses 6 through 9. The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Our second reading comes from John chapter 21, verses 1 through 14. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. They said to him, We will go with you. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, Children, you have no fish, have you? They answered him, No. He said to them, Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, It is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, Bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, Come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, Who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead.
Oh, what a poetic and picturesque vision the prophet Isaiah paints of the peaceable kingdom to come on earth. The wolves and the lions shall lie down and dwell peaceably with the oxen and the lambs, and a little child shall lead them. In like manner, in our communion remembrance today, so can a little child lead us exuberantly into the sheer joy of our celebration of this same kingdom now come, Christ's Father's will through him now done on earth as it is in heaven. Some years ago on Communion Sunday in a downtown Presbyterian church near Denver where we lived, all the baptized people were lined up after the sermon down 2 central aisles to receive the elements by intinction from the pastor and the elders. The pastor held out a loaf of bread before her, inviting each comer to pinch off a piece for themselves and proceed to the juice and the wine down the line in either direction. Among these comers was a mother's 5-year-old boy, wide-eyed with anticipation and enthralled with the promise of the proceedings. Maybe, just possibly, his first communion ever. As the little child approached the bread, Pastor Lori leaned over and held the loaf out to him and said, "The body of Christ," and he took it the whole loaf. Before she knew what had happened, he had eagerly grasped the entire loaf of bread from her hands into his and held it out before him, just as she had, as he made his way down to the juice. All she could do was smile past her own now empty hands as she watched him go, and with an exuberantly delightful smile on her own face, laugh and say, well, I guess he just really needed a lot of communion today. You might say that along with that little boy and all the rest of us, both as individuals and as a people, the whole world seems in need of a lot of communion today. All that is necessary is that we come as spiritual children, marveling at the incredible simplicity of the charge Christ gives to us as we do. How relieving it is to reflect on all the things Jesus did not say to do as we come. Thankfully, he did not say, take, comprehend, or take, explain in 1,000 words or less. Comprehension and understanding may well follow, but that is not what his disciples were charged with when he handed them the bread and the wine. He said, take, eat, take, drink. He did not say, take and go make this a reality in the world, nor even take, give this bread and this wine to the world. Creativity and bold, generous initiatives may well follow, but that is not his charge to us or to anyone else at this table. He says to each of us, take, eat of this bread yourselves. Take, drink of this, all of you. Take it in. This is what I want you to do in remembrance of my presence. For I am the bread of life, I am the vine. You who come to me shall not hunger. You who believe in me shall never thirst. And it is not only around this symbolic table that we partake. One of the early church fathers, Athanasius, said that when Christ came into the world, he entered into all things. He may well have added that he came into and became hidden in all things, in all places, in all people. Therefore, just take, eat, take, drink wherever you go. Take my presence in. Mind you, we need not try to take in the whole loaf. With Christ, who is the bread of life, a small tasting can be enough and sufficient unto our days. Mixing a small taste in with the longings of our hearts. For the kingdom of heaven is in our longings as well as it is in everything else. So even when our yearnings are painful, a small taste of communion in the wilderness, like a single moment of manna from heaven combined with the yearnings in our hearts for the promised land, can add up to a mysterious fullness in our souls, even for a moment difficult, if not impossible, to describe. The great Southern-born preacher and teacher of preachers, Fred Craddock, found himself stranded once many years ago in a freak snowstorm far from home in Winnipeg, Canada, for which he was not prepared with appropriate clothing. With 2 or 3 feet of snow piled up outside his motel door, the airports were all closed and his lectures had all been canceled, and it was all he could do to bundle up with some toilet paper under his cap to keep his head warm and inch his way a few blocks down to a bus depot that had a cafe. Half of the stranded people in Western Canada were in that cafe, he said, and someone finally made a place for him in their booth. He asked the gruff owner in a greasy apron for a menu and was told they had soup. Soup is what I was thinking of ordering, Fred replied. The soup came and it was terrible. and he put his spoon down and just warmed his hands around the bowl like a stove. Then the door opened and the wind and snow blew in along with a disheveled woman from the street. Someone shouted, "Close the door." The woman sat down at the counter and asked for a glass of water. "What are you going to order?" the greasy apron demanded. "I just want water and to get warm." The man got loud about it. "Look, lady, I've got paying customers here, and if you're not ordering, you've got to leave. What do you think this is? A church?" She started to leave, but as she did, everyone in the cafe got up to leave too, and Fred stood and moved with them. "I knew I was voting for something," he said, "but I wasn't sure what it was." Seeing them all heading for the door, the greasy apron shouted out, all right, sit back down, the woman can stay." And he brought her some soup. Everyone sat back down. Fred wasn't preaching, he wasn't teaching, he wasn't even talking, he was just sitting and listening with everyone else to all the sipping. The place grew quiet, but I heard the sipping of that awful soup. I said, "I'm going to try that again." I put my spoon to the soup. You know, it was not bad soup. Everybody was eating this soup. I started eating this soup, and it was pretty good soup. I have no idea what kind of soup it was. It was sort of gray. I don't know what was in it. But I do recall when I was eating it, now, he writes, it tasted just a little bit like bread and wine. Just a little like bread and wine. So it's now barely 10 days after the death and resurrection of Jesus, and the disciples are flummoxed, not knowing what to do with themselves, let alone do with this beloved teacher of theirs that seems not bound by the bonds of death. They've seen him twice now since his crucifixion, and not knowing what to do, they decide to go back to what they do know, to what is familiar, to what does make sense. Peter, on a flummoxed whim, says, "I'm going fishing." And half of the 12 hop in the boat and say, "We'll go with you." Jesus is about to reveal himself to them for a third time, but they don't know him from a stranger on the beach. Whoever this strange man is asks them tenderly how their long failed night of fishing has gone, and then suggests that they keep doing what they're doing, but to just do something with it a little differently. They lower their nets on the opposite side of the boat, and suddenly their nets are so filled with fish they can barely haul them in. Now Jesus has their attention. John recognizes who it is and whispers to Peter that it is the Lord. And Peter immediately puts his clothes on. For some reason, he had taken them off in order to fish. And in my favorite line in the whole passage, it says, Peter jumped into the sea. He leapt into the sea. The English Standard Version says Peter sprang into the sea. One can almost feel the exuberance of the little boy in Peter who just can't help himself. "Come, have some breakfast," Jesus says. And Peter wants it all, the whole loaf, and he wants it right now, and so he sprang into the sea. Less than a fortnight before this morning, the disciples had all been in attendance at a somber, foreboding evening meal with Jesus in an upper room. And if we call that the Last Supper, what do we call this? The first breakfast? The first reminder of the Lord's Supper, a remembrance in the Lord's presence? Peter's first communion? Peter's and all the other disciples' eyes are once again as wide as they've ever been, whatever is going to happen next, in the face of all that they increasingly do not know. What they all do know together for absolute sure in this moment as they sit around that fire is that they're not in Kansas anymore. That same poet and prophet Isaiah sang elsewhere in his enduring text of this same mysterious gift of resurrection and the promise of transformation. By proclaiming that the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, all flesh shall see it together. Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain and hill be made low, on the uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. On my own way alone to Brooklyn for the first time by train during my seminary years in New Jersey, I passed through New York's Penn Station many years ago now. I remember watching as I did an impeccably dressed African-American businessman in a three-piece suit reading the paper on a raised wooden chair, as just beneath him a middle-aged white man attentively shined his shoes. It was a searing image of some rough places slowly being made smooth. I caught the first of 3 subways south and east beneath the East River to Montauk Avenue on my way to helping a French anti-poverty organization called Fourth World conduct what it called a street library, reading to children on the sidewalks in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Brooklyn, perhaps in all of America. I arrived at the wrong stop, walked for about a mile, took 2 bus rides, talked to 2 Metro cops behind glass, and for 2 of the longest hours in my life to that point, finally learned what it was to be different. Meaning I was, for the first time in my life, a racial minority of one. For as far as my eyes could see or my feet walk, I found my fears in dire need of the very hospitality I had thought I was coming to bring. All I knew was that I wasn't in Nebraska anymore. It may indeed well be that when we find ourselves, rather than others to be the strangers drinking in the soup of hospitality, that we can find ourselves tasting the real bread of the gospel's promise, almost as if for the first time. It's still embarrassing to say, but in walking down streets of Brooklyn for a couple of hours as the only white person I could see, I became belatedly aware that white is a color. I realized I was colored just like everybody else in the world. My color was white. I kept walking. I made it to the appointed street for my afternoon engagement. Throughout the hot afternoon, I sat with 2 other volunteers on rugs we had spread out on the sidewalk in front of a row of tenements. And we read library books to children and helped them paint pictures of their neighborhood. I was constantly aware of being watched now by 2 older black men, one sitting in, the other standing next to an abandoned car parked in an alleyway 3 doors down. A grandmother sat on a stoop. 2 teens shot hoops at a netless basketball rim on a pole. Cars drove by as a young girl watched from an upstairs window. Seeing through colorblind eyes is one thing. The desire to be seen through colorblind eyes is quite another. But as we were saying our goodbyes to the kids until another day, one of the men in the alley went out of his way, subtly, to catch my eye. It did not take him long. When he had it, he nodded to me, as if to let me know that if this was what I was come to do, I was welcome on his street anytime. It was one brief and blessed moment of color blindness between 2 Americans, a moment of manna filled with the possibility of changes of heart and history, a hallowed highway being made straight in the wilderness desert, in a land of both fulfilled and unfulfilled promises. So I rode in a van with my fellow Fourth World teammates back across the Williamsburg Bridge to the Lower East Side and caught the subway up to Penn Station to wait for my Northeast Corridor New Jersey train. I wandered as I waited, as was my custom, and I bought a small snack box to take with me to eat on the train home, even though my soul was already full. I had lowered my nets into the world in the same way I naturally do, but just a little differently this time, in a different place, over the opposite side of an urban eastern seaboard boat this time, and those nets had come up full. I had leapt into the sea, and the whole earth for a flashing moment felt full of the knowledge of the Lord. The waters, in the ancient words of Isaiah, seemed to cover the sea, as if Christ's whole loaf of living bread had been offered up to me. I have no actual, real memory now of what exactly was in that little white snack box. It was sort of a pre-packaged, processed protein presentation of some sort with some salty and sweet goodies. I don't know exactly what was in it, but in my memory, or shall I say in my remembrance, I do recall how it tasted, and I think I could describe it to you. When I was eating it, as I rumbled along now in silence on a brown naugahyde seat inside one of those old New Jersey transit cars full of strangers, clickety-clacketing our own ways home from stop to stop, the contents of that snack box had the distinct aroma of grilled fish. Yes, that's what it was, with some of it tasting just a little bit like bread and wine.